And now, part 2 of chapter 30. The sky had grown steadily darker, and now a cool, damp breeze blew through the square. The citizens appeared to take notice, some gazing upward at the menacing clouds, others hurrying to the exits. Drops of rain began falling, leaving dark spots on the light gray pavement. Good, thought Will, surveying the field of play. It would be much easier to deal with his guests if the non-combatants cleared out. "On your right, Will," Emily suddenly shouted. He turned his head and saw the outlaw who'd been standing to the right of the southern entrance rushing toward him, closing fast and brandishing what looked like a short sword. The weapon concerned him, for, with his cane now in pieces, his opponent had the advantage of reach. Instinctively, Will assumed a defensive stance and made ready to meet the charge. Then it dawned on him that despite the loss of his cane, he was far from unarmed. His instincts were still adjusting to his newly acquired skills. Will relaxed his guard and stood erect. With no townspeople in the line of fire, there was little reason to waste time with this man. He took a breath, pursed his lips, and as one would extinguish a candle, blew. A powerful, concentrated gust hit his attacker like an invisible train, driving him backwards through the air until he met the unyielding stone wall enclosing the square. His limp and seemingly lifeless body slumped to the ground, flickered for a moment, then disappeared. The drifter on the far side of the southern gate had begun advancing as well. But after witnessing the fate of his comrades, he stopped and appeared to be having second thoughts. The lookout above the entrance jumped down from the wall, landing deftly just behind his reluctant friend. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted, slapping the back of the young man's head as he passed by him and charged toward Will and Emily. At the same time, the drifter kneeling on the ground by the fountain, having finally recovered from the painful blow dealt him by Charlotte, now rose to his feet. He stared at Will for a moment, then sneered and vanished, instantly, without warning and without a trace. Perhaps he'd seen enough. On the opposite side of the plaza, the men who'd been guarding the eastern entrance were moving in Will and Emily's direction, but casually, at a leisurely walk, apparently in no hurry to join the fray. It seemed puzzling, but since they posed no immediate threat, Will could shift his attention back to the other two thugs, both of whom were now rapidly approaching. Unfortunately, he couldn't dispatch them in the same manner he'd taken his last assailant off the board, for there were people entering the square through the gate directly behind him. As he considered how to deal with these two, he heard Emily cry out another warning. "Look out! Behind you!" But before he could turn, Will felt a sharp blow on the back of his neck. Stunned, he stumbled forward a few steps, but kept his feet under him. Assuming that he'd been struck by their prisoner, who must have escaped from Emily, he spun around and, to his surprise, found himself facing the drifter who'd stood by the fountain a moment ago. He hadn't abandoned the fight after all. He'd merely repositioned himself. Will cocked his arm and lunged at him, but before he could deliver the punch, the man was gone, disappearing as quickly as he had before, leaving Will and Emily staring at each other, both bewildered. Emily's eyes suddenly shifted, widening in alarm as they focused on something behind him. Turning his head, Will saw that the lookout was almost upon him, his head lowered and his arms extended forward, apparently meaning to tackle him, while the younger man, having found his courage, followed in his wake. Will dodged the attack, slipping to one side and leaving the man grasping only air. He then kicked his off-balance foe in the seat of his pants, sending him sprawling forward onto the ground, close to Emily's feet. With her free arm, Emily swung her purse over her head in a high vertical arc, allowing gravity to bring the bag and its load of precious ballast down onto the man's back, flattening him against the pavement. The young henchman, who'd been running straight at Will, suddenly swerved to his left and dashed towards Emily. Will was out of position and could not head him off in time, but fortunately, Emily saw him coming. She seized the arm of her still tipsy captive with both hands, letting the heavy purse drop and hang from her wrist, and swung him into the path of the oncoming enemy. The two men collided shoulder to shoulder, sending the charging drifter staggering sideways, now on a collision course with Will. Having only a split second to act, Will hardened his body, turning his flesh to stone, and threw his elbow into the man's jaw, knocking him off his feet and onto his back. Will lifted his leg, intending to stomp down on the dazed intruder's chest, when again he was hit from behind, this time in the center of his back. Without turning, Will leaned forward and kicked backwards. He presumed the blow had come from the same man who'd blindsided him a moment ago, and hoped to strike the elusive adversary before he could vanish again. Feeling his foot catch something solid, Will spun and landed in a stance facing his stealthy opponent. He saw that his kick had done damage, for the quick-skipping drifter was on the ground, grimacing and clutching his rib cage. He appeared to have a difficult time breathing, and, following a few painful gasps, he disappeared again, but slowly this time, and for good. Will turned and stepped over to the man whom he'd sent to the ground with his elbow. He was still conscious, but just barely. His jaw appeared to be broken. Looking more closely at his face, Will saw that he was hardly more than a boy, 16 perhaps. "Hey," said Will, nudging him with his foot. The helpless young man looked up at him, and in his eyes, Will saw confusion, pain, and fear. "Leave," he told him firmly. "Now." The lad nodded submissively, then quickly obeyed, melting away and leaving a light shadow where his body had briefly shielded the pavement from the rain. In the meantime, with several well-placed kicks and a second swing of her purse, Emily had managed to keep the downed lookout from getting to his feet, while still holding on to her prisoner. But suddenly, rather than trying to stand or escape her reach, the man rolled toward her and grabbed one of her legs with both arms. "I've got her," he yelled frantically to his friend. "Go! Jump!" His cries seemed to rouse their hostage from his stupor, and he now grabbed her wrist with his free hand. But before the two could carry Emily away, for together they might succeed, Will leapt into the air, over the man at her feet, and landed at her side. With one hand, he quickly took hold of Emily's arm, ensuring she was firmly anchored here, before striking her captive captor with the other, a light blow to the midsection, meant only as a warning. Helpless, and with no hope of making off with Emily, the battered drifter let go of her. He then tried to pull away, but she doggedly maintained her hold on him. Will seized his other arm. "Let him go. I've got him," he shouted to Emily. She complied, at which point, trusting that the thug wrapped around her leg could not abduct her by himself, Will released her. Emily then tried to free herself from the man on the ground, shaking her leg while swatting at his head, but he refused to let go. "Fine," she said, looking down at him. "Then enjoy the ride." Emily bent her unfettered leg and jumped straight up, carrying him high into the air with her. Her passenger shrieked and released his hold, but not until he was nearly 15 feet above the ground. He managed to land feet first on the hard pavement, though not as nimbly as when he jumped down from the wall, for he lost his balance and fell forward onto all fours. Emily rose another few feet, hovered for a moment, then dropped, landing heavily on the man's back, collapsing his arms and crushing his chest against the pavement. She sprang off his shattered body and turned, ready to deliver a kick, but she saw he was finished. "Bye-bye," she said, watching him dissolve away.